Okay, let's talk about a few things you should know before you get started. First, I want to define a couple of terms that we're going to be using and have already been using: small business and entrepreneur. Let's talk about small business first. Okay, so legally, the definition of a small business is an independently owned and operated business that is not dominant in its field. So, what does that mean? So, an independent business, meaning you're not part of a larger conglomerate, something like that. You're your own freestanding thing, and it is not dominant in its field, meaning, if my small business is a restaurant, it's not, McDonald's. It's not like the biggest thing that everyone knows. So it's quite a subjective definition, right? Both those two terms are fairly subjective, or could be subjective, and that's fine. Small business is kind of a fluffy word. And it's not necessarily something we're going to even strive for. We're not going to strive to be a small business. We're going to strive to be the dominant force in our field, right? But kind of by definition, when you start a business, it is a small business. Even if you're Henry Ford, when you first started your car company, it was a small business until it became what it is now, which is definitely not a small business, although it's maybe getting smaller. I don't know. Okay, entrepreneur. This is a more fun word. This doesn't have a strict definition, and there's no real legal definition for an entrepreneur. You are one or you're not one. It's kind of like, in my world, it's kind of like musician. Like anyone can call themselves a musician. Doesn't mean you're a good musician or a bad musician. It's just a word. But typically, we think of entrepreneurs as being more motivated by money than social causes. Now, that's kind of the textbook definition, and I think it's kind of dated. So in the next section, the next kind of big section of this class, we're going to talk about objectives, like business objectives, things that you should be thinking about with your business. But one of them will be, basically we're going to look at 4 objectives: the service objective, profit objective, social objective, and growth objective. The classic definition of entrepreneur means that they put all their weight in the service and the profit, meaning they're going to think about, first and foremost, how can I make a thing that people will buy, and how can I make a lot of money selling that thing, and perhaps the goal is to sell the company, not necessarily grow the company, but get it to a point where you can sell it to a bigger company. And again, this is a fluffy word that's not a strict definition, and I think definition of entrepreneur is changing wildly. I do think of myself as an entrepreneur, but I don't think of myself as that. I think of someone who thinks about, I think about profits and service, the thing I'm making, but I also think about social objectives and growing and all these other things too. So take that one with a grain of salt. But those are 2 words that we need to think about. Now, they work together, right? So you are an entrepreneur if you are starting small businesses, or just one small business. You can consider yourself an entrepreneur. Even if you're taking this class, you could consider yourself an entrepreneur if you like. That is all fine. It's not the case that you are either a small business owner or an entrepreneur. I think at one time that was the case for how we just used those words in our language, but it's not really the case anymore. Someone who starts a small business is an entrepreneur. Especially if you started more than one small business or currently have more than one small business, then you are definitely an entrepreneur. The word entrepreneur comes from, I believe it comes from an old French adaptation, meaning to undertake. So entrepreneur is like undertake. And not undertake as in like the undertaker, like bring something to its death. That would be poetically brilliant if that was the origin of the word. But I don't think it is. I think it's like to undertake a venture, to start something, I think is where we get that word. So an entrepreneur is someone who starts things. It actually goes back to a music definition. I think the oldest use of the word that we have, if I remember right, is an entrepreneur was someone who like put on plays and operas and things like that. A producer, basically. What we now call a producer of an event. In kind of 18th century France, I think the word entrepreneur kind of meant that. So it was someone who mounted these big scale performances of shows. And now we've kind of adapted it for the last 100 years or so to mean someone who starts businesses. So strictly speaking, that's what it means. So congratulations, you are an entrepreneur, and you are very soon to be a small business owner. In fact, by the end of this course, if you're not already, you will be a small business owner because we're going to file the paperwork and do the whole bloody mess. So let's move on to a couple other things that you should know before you get started.